Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Um, where might we turn for political wisdom today? Where can we gain a deep critique of our nation's current weaknesses, its trajectory, and how to sustain it? We might be troubled if we take a quick survey about. If we look at the public square, little exists beyond day-to-day partisan fanaticism, vain story chasing, scandal mongering, or the latest social science study meticulously proving what common sense already knows. So, what about the academy, that great repository of wisdom? If we turn to the famous schools of public policy, there you get an education in policy tweaking, statistics, accounting, and bureaucratic management theories. Well, what about political science departments? There you can find individuals who have devoted their entire careers to studying congressional voting patterns so as to profoundly conclude that Republican voters generally vote for Republican candidates. Every minutia under the sun is studied with the greatest care as though the world was at stake, and often the most important questions are neglected. These are the desiccated sources that should provide statesmen with an education. But where would they develop judgment and prudence? Where are political examples studied, analogous to our current circumstances, that can guide us? In light of these questions, we've invited Hugh Liebert today to show what Rome can teach us. Much like we are doing today, Rome's policies ended up undermining its own citizens' virtues, which greatly contributed to its decline. In our attempt to prevent this from happening here, Rome's example offers useful solutions. Now, Hugh Liebert is an associate professor of American politics, policy, and strategy at West Point. He studied at Harvard College and got a PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. And he has a book on Plutarch, Plutarch's Rome, and he also has a book coming out soon enough on Edward Gibbon, also a study of Rome. Please welcome Hugh Liebert.
Thank you. Thanks, Arthur. Thanks, all of you, for being here. As Arthur mentioned, I am a professor at West Point and therefore an employee of the federal government. So it's conventional for us to begin by just warning you that the views I'm going to give you don't necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Military Academy, the Department of Defense, or anyone but myself, although I hope to persuade at least a few of you before the lecture is done. It's always exciting for me to visit Washington, D.C., and it's really exciting to be here at such a pivotal time in our own politics. I feel a bit like I imagine a Roman citizen from the provinces must have felt in traveling to Rome to see a new emperor. One hears very strange things out in our provinces about what's going on in the metropolis these days. Some say that our republic is about to fall apart. Others say that there's a fundamental realignment going on of our political parties. Others say that the post-1989 global order is now being rewritten. Also out in the provinces, one hears that whatever it is that's happening now, the Heritage Foundation is guiding it. So what I'd really like to do for the next 45 minutes or so, if I could, is just to play Socrates and ask you all questions and try to figure out what's going on and why. But unfortunately, in order to make this visit, I had to persuade Arthur that I had some knowledge worth passing on to you in a lecture. So that's what I'm going to do. It wouldn't necessarily be easy to persuade anyone except for someone as enlightened as Arthur, for a number of reasons that I have something to say. The most important of which has to do with two different ways of thinking about politics. The scholar pursues knowledge about politics ostensibly for its own sake, whereas the advisor to politicians, I imagine, has to think about more practical things, because politicians always have more practical things in mind. And as a result, it's not really clear always what exactly the scholar has to say to the politician or the advisor of politicians. The scholar can seem pedantic, out of touch, foolish when he wanders too close to the forum. And that's especially a problem for a scholar like myself of ancient political thought, who could seem quite foolish indeed by claiming to be able to teach folks in Washington, D.C. anything about politics. So I'd like to begin just by asking why we scholars, we politicians, we advisors to politicians, why do we concern ourselves with antiquity and ancient politics? Why does it seem reasonable that we might learn something of value to us from Rome or from Athens? It seems to me that there are basically two reasons for that. First, antiquity gives us many useful seeming historical analogies. It's not altogether uncommon today to hear our politics compared to the fall of the Roman Republic, when populist politicians like Marius and Caesar mobilized the plebs to overturn an aristocracy of corrupt elites. Right? There are lots of analogies like that. The other main reason we turn to antiquity, I think, is that it seems to teach us something, or it promises to teach us something about the unchanging nature of political life. So when we study Athenian democracy, for instance, we might learn something not only about Athens, but about democracy as such. Now, those two ways of reading the ancients for historical analogies and for insights into the unchanging nature of political life have been quite prominent in American political thought from the time of the founding. And I'd like to use both of them today to read the ancients a bit like the founders did. I think that makes them useful not only for scholars. The argument I'd like to make today turns on a historical analogy and a claim about the unchanging nature of political life. Let me start from nature. I'm going to suggest that ancient political thought helps us to appreciate how the size of a political body changes the character of political life. The ancients famously, notoriously, focused their thinking on the small city, or polis. But when an expansive and enduring empire arose, some ancient philosophers tried to adapt the political thought of Plato and Aristotle to help them explain their new situation. In doing so, they articulated what's proper to each of the strata in which humans can live politically, primarily the city and the empire. I'm going to lay out their argument on this point, as I understand it, and suggest that since their insights rest on a plausible understanding of human nature, they can help us to understand our own political situation too. I also want to raise a historical analogy for our collective consideration. When we look to antiquity for analogies, we tend to look only to sovereign states. We turn to Athens in the Greek cities, right up until the point when they're conquered by Alexander and Rome, at which point we turn our analogizing energy to Rome, right up until the 5th century when the barbarian hordes rush in. Sovereignty, understood on the basis of our modern nation states to include authority over domestic and foreign politics, sovereignty is the barrier for entry to our collective attention. But I think that does a disservice to both ancient and modern politics. And to explain why, I want to read for you a short story from Plutarch's Life of Julius Caesar. Okay, so this is Plutarch. In his journey, as Caesar was crossing the Alps and passing by a small village of the barbarians, with but few inhabitants, and those wretchedly poor, his companions asked the question among themselves by way of mockery, if there were any canvassing for offices there, any contention which should be uppermost, or feuds of great men one against another, to which Caesar made answer seriously, "For my part, I had rather be the first man among these fellows than the second man in Rome." That's a great story. It's a really good story. So it's a great story about Caesar's great ambition, yes? But there's also something else going on in that story. This barbarian village has been under Roman control for a while when Caesar and his men passed through it. Like most of the cities Rome conquered, and like most of Rome's allies, it wouldn't have controlled its foreign policy in any meaningful sense. But only an arrogant and mistaken metropolitan would think that political life was the exclusive property of Rome. Caesar knew better. This story suggests to us that political autonomy, what we call sovereignty, is better viewed as a continuous variable rather than a dichotomous variable. That is, it's like a sliding scale as opposed to an on-off switch. And that raises an important question for us. What happens to political life when sovereignties and political allegiances overlap or intersect or conflict? Clearly, authorities and allegiances did overlap in the ancient world and do today. But the right sort of ancient analogy to help us think about that condition won't come from the glory days of the autonomous cities or from Rome, if you look at Rome from the perspective of the metropolis. It's more likely to come to us from the provinces. Thankfully, we have a particularly compelling provincial view of political life under the empire in the work of an author I've drawn from already, Plutarch of Chaeronea. We know Plutarch as the author of the famous Parallel Lives. I'll suggest that we should also know Chaeronea, a small polis conquered by Rome in the 2nd century, but still a site of meaningful political life in the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era. So that's what I'd like to do today. I'm going to begin by laying out a historical analogy between the polises under the Roman Empire and our own small cities. And then I'm going to make a philosophical argument about how the size of political bodies changes the nature of political life. And then I'll conclude, probably straying way too close to the forum for my own good, by drawing out some implications from Plutarch's view of Rome that can help us understand some of the momentous changes that are underway in our own politics. Okay? So, since Plutarch will be our guide for much of this talk, I'd like to start by telling you a bit about who he was and what he wrote. Plutarch was a Greek. He lived under the Roman Empire from about 45 to 120 of our era. He was born under the Emperor Claudius. He survived Domitian. He died under Hadrian in what Edward Gibbon called the Age of the Antonines. The great historian Tacitus was almost a perfect contemporary of his. That helps put him on the map. Plutarch left behind a vast collection of writings, but he's most famous for one work, the Parallel Lives. That work consists of 46 biographies of Greek and Roman statesmen. One Greek is always paired with one Roman, and then there's a short comparison of the two after the pair is presented. Even if you haven't read that work recently, the Parallel Lives, and I won't ask for a show of hands, but if you haven't read it recently, you still know a lot about it, because you know many of the people whom Plutarch has influenced. Shakespeare, for instance, took Plutarch as his main source for the Coriolanus, the Julius Caesar, and the Antony and Cleopatra. Montaigne loved him. Rousseau said of Plutarch, quote, he was the first author I read in my childhood. He will be the last I read in my old age. He's almost the only author I have never read without gaining something. On our side of the pond, the American founders read Plutarch with great care. They took their pseudonyms, Publius most famously, from characters who they came to know from Plutarch. We actually have a notebook of Alexander Hamilton's, young Alexander Hamilton was aide-de-camp to Washington. It shows him reading the lives and taking extracts from it, from the lives of the Spartans in particular. That scene apparently was cut from the musical, which is really unfortunate. Every Plutarch scholar wishes that that weren't true, but anyway, but we have this notebook, so it's true that Hamilton was reading the lives. For all of these readers, Plutarch was treasured because he offered an education in civic virtue. And that way of reading Plutarch continued well into the 19th century, when Emerson called Plutarch's Parallel Lives a Bible for heroes. And Nietzsche enlisted Plutarch in his battle against egalitarianism. And I want to read you a little Nietzsche on Plutarch. Satiate your soul with Plutarch, this is Nietzsche. And when you believe in his heroes, dare at the same time to believe in yourself. With 100 such men, raised in this unmodern way, that is to say, become mature and accustomed to the heroic, the whole noisy sham culture of our age could now be silenced forever. Now, wanting to become more virtuous in order to overturn the noisy sham culture of an age is a worthy enough reason for us to read Plutarch too, I think. But I think there's something more than edification or inspiration that we can learn from Plutarch. As I understand them, the lives deserve to be read alongside the writings of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero as works of political philosophy. They're not just a museum collection of admirable statesmen, but a deep reflection on what deserves to be admired, how admiration relates to political action, and how our political condition might influence the link between admiration and action. To get at that set of themes, we need to start by studying the architecture of the museum itself, rather than just rushing in to admire the portraits. So the first thing we notice when we approach the Parallel Lives from outside is the title, Parallel Lives, both words of which deserve some explanation. First, lives. The Greek word for life is best translated as biography, and Plutarch's main work fits very recognizably in that genre. A life tells you the actions and character of an individual from his birth to his death. But the Greek word for life also means way of life. One can speak of the life of the Greeks, for instance. And this meaning suggests that the biographer writes prototypes or models. Alexander's or Caesar's life is a record of actions and a way of life that the reader might adopt as his or her own. Plutarch's reader is aided in that task by one of the hallmarks of Plutarchian biography, which is an attention for fine details. Plutarch famously says in the introduction to his life of Alexander that he's looking for the signs of a man's soul. And these show in small things, like jokes or sayings, as opposed to battles where thousands fall. So Plutarch shows you Alexander on the battlefield, to be sure, but he also follows Alexander back into his tent after the battle. The effect on the reader is a powerful sense of personal intimacy. One gets to know these legends as only their closest colleagues could have known them. Plutarch says, in fact, that his biographies make their subjects seem like people he's invited over to a dinner party. One can see them in all of their individuality, but again, the point isn't to study them in their idiosyncrasy, it's to study their soul, their character, their virtues and vices. And that's what a life allows you to do. But Plutarch didn't write just lives, he wrote parallel lives. Plutarch's lives, like Noah's Ark, contain couples. Right? There's always one Greek, one Roman, and then a comparison at the end of the pair. That way of presenting biographies in parallel is unique to Plutarch, and it's worth considering why he made that innovation. The key to that, I think, lies in these comparisons that Plutarch would write at the end of A Pair of Lives. After presenting a pair, Plutarch argues aggressively for one person in the pair, and then turns and makes a similarly aggressive case for the other person in the pair. The effect of that is to prevent us from passively admiring a diptych of heroes. Instead, we have front row seats at a competition, a boxing match of sorts, between the heavyweights of the ancient world. We consider one boxer in detail, then another, and then in the comparison, we see them fight. After they fight, they stare at the audience, at you in particular. Plutarch uses the second person. They're looking at you for a decision as to who won on points. Plutarch arranges those fights, but he never decides who comes out on top. The point of his writing Lives in Parallel isn't to show that Greeks are superior to the Romans or vice versa, but to take advantage of how competitions can reveal the character of the competitors, and to exercise the reader's capacity to form judgments about virtue. Admiration of Alexander or Caesar can be a passive affair, but deciding which of the two is better requires us to consider what exactly we mean by better, and to apply that understanding in a particular case. All right, so much for the title of Lives. When we open the doors of the museum to consider whose portraits are on the walls, we make another interesting discovery about this work. The only individuals who qualify for inclusion in the parallel lives are statesmen. Plutarch admired, we know from other writings, people who weren't statesmen. He admired philosophers in particular. He and his friends would hold annual birthday parties for Socrates and Plato. So he really admired them. But they play only supporting roles in the parallel lives. He's interested there in a certain sort of human being, the statesman or the political man. He's also interested in a specific chronological period. The last of Plutarch's Greeks, Philopoemen, dies as the Romans are taking control of the Greek cities. The last of his Romans, Antony, witnesses Octavian establish the empire. Now, if Plutarch's Greeks then live in autonomous cities, the Romans prior to the empire, if Plutarch were interested simply in stimulating his reader's desire to be virtuous, he could easily have included lives of morally admirable men who were not statesmen, and he could have studied time periods other than the ones he did. His contemporaries, like Tacitus, certainly wrote lives of admirable people from the empire, admirable imperial servants, for instance. The portraits Plutarch chose to include in his lives suggest that he wanted his readers to understand something about politics, and in particular, the political life that preceded the empire. Now, that sort of a project is valuable in any age for forming virtuous individuals who are capable of making judgments about virtue. And Plutarch has found readers in a wide variety of political contexts, from medieval monasteries all the way up to the nascent republics of the 18th century. But this project had a special significance in Plutarch's time, and arguably in ours as well. And so now I want to turn and think through an analogy between Plutarch's time and ours. So let me start with Plutarch's time. As I've mentioned, Plutarch lived under the Roman Empire and wrote the lives, as best we can tell, during Gibbon's Age of the Antonines, which Gibbon called, quote, the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Some of that spirit shows up in Plutarch as well. Plutarch refers to Rome as the hearth of mankind, and he testifies to the fact that provincials held citizenship, high office, and considerable influence. Greek philosophers, for their part, tutored and advised emperors. Their works were distributed globally. They could serve as diplomats from the provinces to the emperor and as propagandists and representatives from the emperor down to the provinces. Seen from the east, Rome could seem the most beautiful of human works, as Plutarch also says, a distant light reaching rosy fingers out across the earth. Rome was the center of things. But that wasn't Plutarch's final word, nor for that matter was it Gibbon's final word. For all of the offices open to them in the imperial hierarchy, Greeks could not aspire to lead truly autonomous cities. In a letter to an ambitious young Greek man of his own day, Plutarch speaks of the Roman boots hovering just over the heads of Greek officials. He reminds the young man that challenging Roman rule can bring exile, or worse, the executioner's axe. Plutarch could compare his contemporaries to actors in a Roman play, children trying to fit into their father's shoes, or slaves with firmly fettered legs. A subject of Rome, he advised, had always to restrain his pride. Even Greek rulers were ruled. And Roman rule limited not only Greek action, but speech. Plutarch advises officials in the cities not to speak too freely of climactic battles like Marathon, or other actions, quote, unsuitable to the present time and conditions. What these speakers do is laughable, Plutarch says, but what is done to them by the Romans is no laughing matter. This brings us to the most remarkable fact about Plutarch's own life. the one that, in my view, gives us the clearest way into his intention in writing the lives as a whole. Plutarch wrote the parallel lives from the tiny Greek polis of Chaeronea. He was a Roman citizen with excellent connections among the empire's ruling elite, who could easily have lived a flourishing life in Rome or in any other of the empire's major cities. He chose not to do so. "I live in a small city," he said, "and I prefer to dwell there that it may not become smaller still." Plutarch involved himself in the politics of his polis as archon, roughly mayor, and in several lesser offices too, and he claimed for that sort of political service a nobility that dignified even the most petty and sordid of local concerns. If one acts on behalf of the polis, Plutarch says, one is not ignoble. On the contrary, quote, "one's attention to duty and zeal are all the greater when applied to little things." Now, part and parcel of Plutarch's own attachment to a small polis was a political stance that combined skepticism towards peers who left the provinces for the metropolis and a vision of the empire that emphasized as much local autonomy as was consistent with peace. Plutarch writes dismissively of, quote, "Chians, Galatians, or Bithynians who are not content with whatever portion of either repute or power among their own fellow countrymen has fallen to their lot, but weep because they do not wear the patrician's shoe." He urges his own compatriots, instead of lighting out for the big city, to stay at home and work to preserve what remained of Greek autonomy. Quote, "The statesman, while making his native city readily obedient to its sovereign, must not further humble it. When the leg has been fettered, do not go on and subject the neck to the yoke." What, then, could the project of the parallel lives mean for an author whose own life reflected a deep commitment to the polis, even when it was ruled by a distant empire? One temptation is to see Plutarch as someone who's nostalgic for the glory days of Greece. That's not an uncommon reading of Plutarch. Thomas Macaulay in the 19th century said that Plutarch conceived of liberty as monks conceive of love. So, in other words, he's out of touch, right? He's out of touch. Didn't mean that as a compliment. It's more tempting to conclude that Plutarch intended his vivid portrayals of the statesmen who lived prior to the empire to serve as an ambition suppressant. In the same way that we might read Plato's Republic as elucidating a political ideal so brilliant that our own attachments to worldly regimes is dampened somewhat, we might read Plutarch's praise of ancient statesmen as an implicit condemnation of the present regime. I think there's something to that reading, but there's a more positive element in the lives as well. Plutarch's own commitment to the Greek city under the empire helps us to recognize the significance of the city in the political world his lives depict. Plutarch intends his lives, I think, to reorient his readers' own lives towards the sort of civic action that the polis makes possible, by depicting the cities in the most compelling possible way and training his readers in forms of virtue that were native to the city but foreign to the empire. Plutarch pursues that goal by founding a city of sorts. He resurrects the statesmen of the autonomous cities and makes them known to us in such vivid detail that they come to resemble fellow citizens whom we see not only in public but in their unguarded moments. He sets these individuals in competition with one another and asks us to vote for one over the other. The regime of the lives is a republic then, not an empire. Plutarch invites us, through our imaginative engagement with this literary city, to reconsider and renew our commitment to our own cities, even if their sovereignty is attenuated by an overarching polity. There's a useful analogy to be drawn, I think, between the place of the small city in Plutarch's world and in our own. But analogies usually distort as much as they illuminate, and that's true here too, right? We might ask at this point, what does Pericles' Athens really have to do with Plutarch's Chaeronea, to say nothing of cities like Boise or Latrobe? It seems there's an important difference between leading Greeks in battle and doing the sorts of things that Plutarch did when he was mayor of Chaeronea, like, quote, standing and watching tiles being measured, or concrete or stones being delivered. Say nothing of the issues that we relegate to our local politics. In my hometown, we had heated political competitions for the Mosquito Control Board, which is a very important office in South Florida. But there's still, it seems, a very important difference between fighting mosquitoes and waging the Persian War. So to put a point on it, what in the city could command an ambitious young person's commitment when the city is not sovereign? What we've said so far suggests an answer to these questions, but to do more than just suggest, we need to read the lives not only through the lens of historical analogy, but for what they reveal about the unchanging nature of political life. Okay. So the central theoretical question that Plutarch helps us to answer is this. How does the size of a political body change the character of political life? That wasn't a very prominent question in the works of the most canonical ancient political philosophers. Their central concern was the political regime, which we could define somewhat roughly as the set of habits and political institutions that reflect a city's shared understanding of the good. Or put in brief, you could say that the regime is the city's way of life. In Plato's view, for instance, an aristocratic regime differed from an oligarchic regime because aristocracies considered virtue the authoritative good, whereas oligarchies considered wealth the authoritative good. Plato thought there were 5 definitive types of regime because there were 5 definitive goods that human beings could pursue collectively. For the most part, Plato and his followers studied variations on this regime variable while holding constant the size of the political body. That is, they explored the regimes of the city and didn't have much to say about how politics might differ in political bodies smaller or larger than the city. Plato's student Aristotle gives us the clearest explanation for this focus on the city. Aristotle says that a city is a group large enough to be self-sufficient or autonomous, but small enough to be taken in at a glance or easily seen. If a group is too large, he says, quote, it's not easy for a regime to be present. Who will be general of an overly excessive number, or who will be herald unless he has the voice of Stentor? Stentor, by the way, had a very loud voice. That's the point. Aristotle was, of course, aware of generals like Mardonius and Artabazus and other Persians who led very large armies into battle. And he was aware, too, of humans' capacity to repeat what they've heard, making the volume of one human voice not much of a technical barrier to informing a large crowd. What Aristotle meant to indicate in his definition of the city was not a physical limit per se, but the link between physical and psychological limits. Aristotle gestures, and we don't have much more than a gesture here, at how the body's senses interact with the soul's capacity for knowledge and affection. In a small group, citizens unconsciously acquire, through their senses, the social and moral knowledge of their neighbors that can be brought to bear almost effortlessly on political questions. Allegiances arise around shared memories, shared sensations, and the prospect of shared suffering and celebration. Although all of that follows naturally, as it were, from the city's small size, it doesn't follow that the small city is necessarily well ordered. Aristotle's claim, as I understand it, is only that the physically small city sets the psychological foundations of knowledge and affection, such that a good order has the potential to be built. In his words again, if a group is too large, it's not easy for a regime to be present. This narrow focus on the city has allowed defenders of ancient political philosophy to take one of 2 strategies when applying ancient political thought to political bodies that are larger or smaller than the city. Either you can say that ancient political thought applies regardless of the size of the political body, such that a democratic nation is not essentially different than a democratic polis. Or you can say that ancient political thought applies only to the city, and all other political bodies are political in name only. Critics of ancient political thought often start from something like that last view. Ancient political thought really is deeply tied to the city. Montesquieu, for instance, criticizes Aristotle's view of monarchy because he said Aristotle hadn't attended adequately to how monarchies function in very large political bodies. The authors of the Federalist Papers make a similar sort of critique when they say they feel, quote, sensations of horror and disgust at the rapid succession of revolutions by which the petty republics of Greece and Italy were kept perpetually vibrating between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. And they use those sensations to recommend the great improvements of modern political science, representation and an enlarged orbit that is a bigger size among them. The great political philosopher Pierre Menand has recently resurrected Montesquieu's critique of ancient political thought and applied it to near contemporaries of ours, like Leo Strauss, who want to revive ancient political thought. Now, I think it would be remarkable, it would be really remarkable, if those critics of ancient political thought were correct. After all, the Platonic tradition of philosophy was alive and well when thinking men were confronted with the historical fact of Rome. Philosophers of that era ought to have been capable of recognizing, at least as well as we can, that Rome's willingness to extend citizenship well beyond the boundaries of Rome itself represented an innovation of decisive importance. Indeed, a large number of thinkers, from canonical figures like Polybius, Cicero, Livy, Tacitus, to less well-known figures like Dio of Prusa, Lucan, Aristides, all of these guys thought very deeply about the place of a city within a political body that included several cities. Among the most innovative of those thinkers, who tried to adapt the Platonic tradition of political philosophy to the new phenomenon of Rome, was Plutarch. Plutarch's fundamental theoretical insight on this point can be seen most clearly in the contrast he draws between Sparta and Rome. Plutarch's Sparta is the visible community par excellence. At every fitting time and place, Plutarch writes in the life of Lycurgus, Young Spartans had someone to admonish and correct them. They grew into citizens without the wish or the ability to live for themselves, filled with enthusiasm and love of honor, belonging wholly to their country. On Plutarch's understanding, Sparta is isolated, and isolationist in its foreign policy, not because it fears a revolt of the Helots, as Thucydides and Aristotle had said, but so that its citizens can always see and be seen, so the visible community can maintain itself. Rome, by contrast, is expansive from the first. In his Life of Rome's founder, Plutarch says that, quote, "What most gave increase to Rome was that she always united and incorporated with herself those whom she conquered." Rome's ceaseless expansion and inclusion of new citizens meant that Rome had to depart from the psychological foundations of politics and the body's senses. Instead, political order at Rome would arise from the invisible and the imaginary. In his Life of Rome's second king, Plutarch describes how Numa establishes a sect of philosopher priests as the pacifist rulers of a formerly war-loving city. This unlikely achievement turns on making politics invisible to citizens. Numa sets up his rulers in a private house in the city center, by contrast to Sparta's open-air senate. He buries the books of the law in a hill outside the city, by contrast to Lycurgus, putting them on the hearts of the Spartan citizens. Numa concocts a theology in which gods are unseen, accessed by obscure rituals known only to priests, who, along with the gods, are both loved and feared as a result. Numa's Pax Romana spreads from Rome out into Italy. Indeed, there's little natural limit to the extent of a political body once invisible rulers maintain authority by means of their hold over their citizens' or subjects' imagination. It's possible, starting from Plutarch's insight into the political utility of both the visible and the imaginary, to develop a division of the city and the alternatives to it that is parallel to Plato and Aristotle's notion of the political regime. Building on Pierre Monod's work, we can refer to the types of political body according to their size as political forms. Remember that Plato's division of regimes rested ultimately on an analysis of the distinct goods that humans can pursue collectively. There were 5 such goods, and thus 5 regimes. Where a division of political regime starts from the soul's longing for the good, a division of political form starts from the soul's distinct ways of knowing. If one knows the polity to which one belongs primarily through the body's senses, we can call that polity a city. If through the imagination, then the polity is something else, either a nation, if it's a limited imaginary group, or an empire, if it's an unlimited imaginary group. So by adding this distinction between universality and particularity to the distinction between imagination and vision, we arrive at 3 major political forms: city, nation, and empire. And we can investigate then not only the nature of democracy, but how democracy changes when citizens know each other through vision in a city or through imagination in a nation or empire. Because each of these political forms is rooted in the human soul's modes of knowing, and because vision and imagination are not exclusive of one another, it's possible for political forms to overlap or mix. Indeed, Plutarch's vision of the ideal place of the city within the empire implied a balanced or mixed political form, comparable to the mixed regime described in Aristotle and Polybius. Plutarch didn't think that the city in its purity was feasible in his time. The Greek statesman was too weak to neglect the desires of his Roman superiors, and the Greek intellect, as Plutarch himself demonstrated, was irretrievably aware of the wider human and natural worlds. It wasn't possible, perhaps not even preferable, for Plutarch or his contemporaries to crawl crab-like back into Greece's glorious past. At its best, however, Plutarch's Rome combined the political action of the small city and the peace of the empire, and Rome thus left to political philosophy the task of comprehending the triad of political form, city, nation, and empire, in order to capture for human wisdom some notion of how to sustain that harmony. But reflection on the harmony of those spheres immediately reveals that they tend towards imbalance. And Plutarch was especially concerned that once political identity became dominated by imagination, allegiances arising from intimately shared visible worlds would fade. The larger form might reduce the smaller by means of extracting resources or coercion, as Plutarch indicates when he speaks of the Roman boots hovering over the heads of Greek rulers. But the lure of the patrician shoe, that is, the attraction of being prominent and praised in the imperial capital, is a more insidious threat, because talented provincials pursue it freely, indeed ardently, draining small cities of the talents that might sustain and distinguish them. The same age might thus appear brilliant at the center, while the seeds of decline were just starting to sprout in the periphery. On Gibbon's understanding, in fact, something like this process was well underway in Plutarch's time. As we've seen, Gibbon praises the age of the Antonines for the happiness and prosperity it brought to the human race. But shortly after, he says that the same age contained the latent causes of decay and corruption. Here I'll read a little Gibbon to you. This long peace and the uniform government of the Romans introduced a slow and secret poison into the vitals of the empire. The minds of men were gradually reduced to the same level. The fire of genius was extinguished, and even the military spirit evaporated. Of the provincials, Gibbon says, quote, they received laws and governors from the will of their sovereign, and trusted for their defense to a mercenary army. The posterity of their boldest leaders was contented with the rank of citizens and subjects. The most aspiring spirits resorted to the court or standard of the emperors, and the deserted provinces, deprived of political strength or union, insensibly sunk into the languid indifference of private life. When he wrote those words, Gibbon, of course, knew more about how the story ended than Plutarch did. But Plutarch seems to have anticipated much the same process and to have attempted, by restoring his readers' sense of the city as a perennial scene of political action, to stand athwart history, yelling, "Stop." So now I want to conclude by summing up the argument so far and offering a few specific lessons from Plutarch's Rome. First, to sum up, Plutarch's world and ours contain visible communities with limited but still meaningful sovereignty under the horizon of larger political forms. In order to conserve or restore political virtues that were under threat by the empire, Plutarch founded a literary city, a republic in which his readers were cast as citizens. There, Plutarch studied the nature of the city and the nature of the empire. By distinguishing between the epistemic foundation of the city in vision and the empire in imagination, Plutarch laid the foundation for a theory of political form to complement Plato's theory of political regime. On that basis, he and we could consider how political forms, like political regimes, might be mixed with one another and balanced. Now, I think the first lesson we're tempted to draw from Plutarch So Understood is increased devotion to our own republic. As I mentioned, our founders were great students of Plutarch. They drew from him inspiration for heroic political action, as we saw with the young Hamilton, and a certain kind of visceral republicanism. And probably the best example of that is George Washington's fascination with Cato the Younger, although in that case, Plutarch was filtered through Joseph Addison. But we tend to be distracted, I think, by Federalist Nine's blanket condemnation of ancient politics from realizing how carefully the founders studied ancient political institutions. Madison, in particular, was fascinated by the constitutional mechanics of ancient confederations, and he studied Plutarch and Polybius to learn how sovereign cities could realize the benefits of union without entirely sacrificing their sovereignty. The republic that resulted, the United States, divides sovereignty between national and subnational levels while dedicating itself to a universal proposition. Madison's America, then, might vie with Plutarch's Rome at its best as the practical ideal for harmonizing political forms. And we could conclude our quick tour of Plutarch, then, on a note of self-congratulation. But I think it would be much more useful to end on a series of minor chords. So I'm going to mention instead 3 ways in which Plutarch might correct or critique some of the tendencies in our own politics. First, Plutarch challenges some of our common notions of the best moral education for citizens of a republic. Plutarch thinks that moral education requires admiration. He's obviously not on the side of those who want to tear down every great man and woman to a common level. He holds that souls are formed when their capacity to love, to look up, and to emulate is fully engaged. In that sense, he's an author well suited to conservatives who like to hold up heroes in order to shape citizens and to correct rampant egalitarianism. But Plutarch also offers a challenge to conservatives of this stripe. By writing lives in parallel, he suggests that the heroes we admire should not be cast in marble and elevated above where we can see the sometimes seamy details of their lives. Instead, we should view our heroes in the rough and tumble of Republican life, locked in competition with one another and eager to win praise. A propensity to elevate and worship suits subjects of a monarch or an emperor. Republican citizens are best educated by evaluating competitions between admirable statesmen. Second lesson. Plutarch, I think, helps us to think about the ideals that motivate our political parties. To some degree, our parties split over the principles of our democratic regime, the left championing equality and the right liberty. But since the New Deal and the conservative critique of it that emerged most powerfully in the early 1960s, our parties have also divided over political form. The left champions the large political form, favoring the nation over the state, and often the global community of the nation. The right champions the small political form, favoring the nation over the global community, and frequently the state over the nation. Plutarch offers a good corrective, I think, to both views with his vision of the city within an empire. Plutarch stresses the centrality of vision to communities that can fully engage individuals as citizens. American states are far too large for that purpose. Even tiny Rhode Island is not an easily seen city in Aristotle's terms. What we call federalism, then, might be desirable for a number of reasons, but in the terminology we've developed here, American states are nations. So for that matter, are so-called cities like New York, LA, and DC. To measure our own world against Plutarch's ideal of vibrant cities within a peaceful empire, we would have to consider the health of our small towns and urban neighborhoods. And to do this adequately requires us to depart from the political bodies, nation and state, that our Constitution prepares us to recognize. Okay, so the third and final lesson from Plutarch's Rome. Plutarch offers an analysis of centralization and how one can resist it. That seems, to me anyway, like it might be useful to those who are trying to productively channel today's populism. And since populism is a term that is now used in 1,000,001 different ways, I just want to stipulate that by populism, I understand the rejection in the name of national communities or peoples of the post-1989 global order and the elites who have presided over that order. Plutarch, as we've seen, criticized the globalizing elites of his own day, his fellow provincials whose only ambition was to wear the shoes of a patrician at Rome. But his was a sympathetic critique for two reasons. First, Plutarch was not anti-Roman. He acknowledged that it was necessary for Greek statesmen to have good relationships with the Romans who ruled them, and he genuinely esteemed the empire for the benefits it provided, peace foremost among them. More importantly, Plutarch understood why the ambitious are naturally drawn to the largest political form on offer. Those who love praise want to be praised by the most people. The desire for praise led Plutarch's peers to Rome, Alexandria, or Athens, just as it leads our young men and women to Washington, New York, and LA. Philosophers before Plutarch had criticized the desire to be widely praised by pointing out that praise from the wisest judge is more desirable than praise from the many, a position that results ultimately in the philosopher's rule over the statesman. Plutarch's defense of the visible community, however, opens up an alternative approach to ambition, one that turns on the information available to the judge rather than the judge's wisdom. Plutarch suggests to the ambitious individual that praise is meaningless unless it's rooted in an intimate knowledge of your character, and this knowledge is available only to those who share a life with you. This insight about the significance and limited availability of the information required to form sound judgments, which is one of Hayek's great insights as well. This applies to the city more broadly. Because the city is rooted in vision and the other senses, that is, forms of knowing that operate constantly and effortlessly, citizens acquire at very low cost the knowledge they need to make sound judgments about their fellow citizens and the shared challenges that might be addressed via politics. Larger political forms require citizens to comprehend and evaluate symbols and abstractions, a skill which seems to be naturally in shorter supply. The city makes lower demands on citizens epistemically in terms of its knowledge, and that seems to favor, so a city favors elites, I think, less than larger forms. Now, Plutarch was the farthest thing from a populist, however one understands that term. He was not eager to tear down the protagonists of his lives, and most of his writing, or a lot anyway, of his writing on contemporary politics consists of critiques of demagogues and quasi-Machiavellian advice to his fellow aristocrats about how they could keep the demos from seizing power. Okay, so he wasn't a populist. But there's nevertheless a certain sort of populism inherent in Plutarch's defense of the city. If elites could be persuaded to focus their pursuit of praise on the small communities that can know their character and action well, there would be both a greater number and greater diversity of elites, and there would be more powerful resistance from the provinces to the centralizing tendencies of large political forms. To the extent we find in our fellow citizens, then, Chians, Galatians, or Bithynians eager only to wear patrician shoes in the imperial capital, and to the extent we are persuaded by Plutarch, renewing civic virtue requires a profound reorientation of our political and scholarly ambitions, away from realms we can know only through imagination and towards the visible communities that endure, even in the absence of perfect political sovereignty. That was an important lesson Plutarch tried to teach Rome, and it strikes me as an important lesson for Washington as well. Thanks very much. Okay, so I get to field questions, so please feel free. I've been asked to tell you to please come up to the microphones if you have a question, or I can repeat if you can't make it to the microphone.
Darren Beatty, use most intelligent and favorite student. I have a question about your lecture. You framed this, and it made me think of Alexander. Alexander versus the fullest, or Alexander versus Aristotle. And you've convinced me that size matters in terms of recapturing some of the fullness. But I wonder what you think about size in addition to structure and composition. So by structure and composition, I'm going to say two things. In terms of structure, I'm thinking of, say, Benjamin Constant, who says not simply the size, but the structure in terms of the relative priority of economic to politics that changes the calculus in terms of how people live together, even aside from size. And you could say that relates to sort of the emergence of mass society. Second is composition, which is something relevant to Federalists, particularly Federalist 2, but also quite relevant, at least implicitly, to Rousseau's attempt to recapture some of the fullest in the modern world. And that has to do with homogeneity, demographics. And I think any kind of comprehensive analysis of our situation with respect to size would also have to take into account these questions of structure and composition. I'm wondering what you thought about that, how that might fit into your analysis.
Yeah, so Darren, you're by far my most intelligent and favorite student, so thank you. No, that's a great question. Yes, I agree completely with the premise that the structure of a city or a political body, let's say, to be neutral about political form, it needs to be considered in addition to the size of it, right? And Alexander's case is very interesting because it has variation, let's say, to speak political scientific, right? On both of those variables, right? It's not a city, Macedonia is, and it's much more like a nation or like a tribal monarchy or something like that, but it's not a city. And it's a monarchy, right, as opposed to a regime. So yeah, to explain the kind of threat that Alexander poses to the cities, we need to account for that. What's interesting in the case of Alexander, on the way Plutarch tells his story, is how much he's oriented by what goes on in the cities, even though he himself comes from a very different place. He seems to really genuinely want to be admired by the Athenians. That's a big part of what drives him to expand. As for the structure of modern republics versus ancient, Darren mentions the change in economics, which Constant talks about, that's true, and the change in composition, and how to think about ancient homogeneity versus modern kind of pluralism, say ethnic pluralism or something like that. On the first point, I think we do have to consider the prominence of economics in modern republics as a factor that distinguishes modern republics from ancient republics. That's entirely true. It might also be the case that for economic considerations, the sort of vital small cities that I'm admiring through Plutarch's eyes might be more or less feasible, right? That would have to be a separate argument to consider that. About homogeneity, I'm a little bit less sure, I think, that there's so stark a difference between modern politics and ancient politics, at least as ancient politics are conceived by Plutarch and Aristotle, I think, too. Because their focus is, in my reading, much more about the kinds of allegiance that have emerged from sharing a visible world together. They turn very little, in fact, on sharing some kind of ethnic identity or anything like that. And so I think there's actually something kind of reassuring if one values pluralism in, broadly American sense, to say that, sharing a visible community seems itself to generate a kind of coherence over time, even if there is some kind of division initially between different ethnicities. But thanks.
Well, a lot of what you engaged in talking about, you were describing, had to do with the city, the empire. But really, the issue is the nation.
That's right.
And the empire.
That's right. Yeah.
Cities have a factor in a lot. Someone here, 18th But what about the situation we're in the United States? We're in an empire, right? As someone said, the big problem in the United States is we're an empire, people are a nation.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're an empire. Certain instances of war, you keep half the nation at that point, you're no longer literally a nation. But what about getting back to something like perhaps civil war, which some say was the right cause for the wrong reason? which I
Mhm.
think is sort of an admirable model. And you're really in the sense that, what, 4 nations there, the economy produces Germans, other
Yeah.
that are together for global reasons, but they operate quite independently in terms of culture and law as a community.
Mhm.
Um, could a nation like that be envisioned in the United States? And been talked about before, Pacific breaking away, Union breaking away. There are such distinct regions you could imagine being rather well-run nations.
Yeah.
Um, just a thought experiment. Is that
Yeah.
something that Plutarch can address? Have you ever thought about it? Because this is sort of the issues you're talking about in a way.
Yeah, so we don't see there the contrast in political forms. That's an interesting thing to think about in the terms I've laid out, right? Because we're really thinking about what constitutes a nation as an imaginary community in the terms I've laid out. And, is there grounds for constituting these separate regions as their own imaginary communities, right, apart from the nation? So that's a different question than the one about the city. That's true. Um, yeah, I don't know that Plutarch offers evidence. I mean, in a way, I think people who focus on the nation, and you're right to say that this is the problem we're thinking about kind of immediately, right? The city issue might be an interesting subordinate question, but nationalism and the fate of the nation is really the first order of the question. People who think seriously about the nation tend to dismiss, I think, ancient political thought on that issue, and to say that really ancient political thought is about cities and empires, and they're only vaguely aware of national communities, which I think isn't perfectly right, right? I mean, we see that actually, for instance, just in the way that Plutarch organizes his lives. You have Greeks on the one hand, right, multiple cities in there, and Rome, which includes provincials who get integrated into Rome as well. So we do get some guidance on that specific question, though. I don't know. I mean, I'd want to think about it in terms of regime more than anything else. Like, is there a way of life in these different areas that makes them incompatible with the way of life that the American nation has as a whole? I think that would be the fundamental question. Yeah. No, I don't think so. He certainly doesn't. So let me just restate the question. Is Plutarch more fundamentally a politician or a philosopher? That's a very deep question. The second issue is, why doesn't he choose exactly in these parallel lives? Like, does he leave it up to kind of arbitrary, just will, right? I like Alexander, right? So let me take the second question because that's maybe a little bit easier. He Plutarch, I think, wants to present the choice as one that you can argue for, right? He wants to deny that it's an arbitrary matter, like I prefer this person to the other. And he does that when he stages these debates or fights, as I was calling them, at the end of the lives, at the end of the pairs, by giving reasons for each, right? This is the reason you might prefer Alexander to Caesar. These are the reasons you might prefer Caesar to Alexander, that sort of thing. So he doesn't decide it, I think, because he wants to engage you, the reader, more in that process of deciding than you would be if Plutarch said, well, we clearly see that Alexander's better than Caesar, right? So I think that's part of the kind of rhetoric he employs to educate, right? At least that's how I read it. And the first question, is Plutarch more a politician or a philosopher? I mean, I think the safest thing to say, although this doesn't answer the deep question, is that he's a philosopher who cares deeply for politics. He does a lot of philosophical work in texts other than the parallel lives. He comments on Plato's Timaeus. He has some very abstract discussions, dialogues, in fact, with visitors who come through Chaeronea, about the meaning of different things connected to Delphi, all these very, he thinks about theology and so on. So he does that, right, that kind of abstract philosophy. But he seems to have conceived the parallel lives as a separate project, almost as if he were drawing a bright line between that kind of philosophy and politics. Why did he do that? My best guess is that he thought that political life itself was under a special kind of threat under the empire, so that he had to make politics attractive and resplendent, totally in its own terms, in order to kind of communicate the virtues that he wanted to communicate. Okay, so I'm going to try to repeat. We have a big national media, right? That seems to be the kind of the main source of honor, right? You want to be praised in the New York Times, right? Everyone wants to be praised in the New York Times or whatever, Fox News, right? So how do we get people, based on their love of honor, their love of praise, to be focused on small cities? That seems like it's very hard to do. So a few things, David. And I think first you could say that the media isn't, I think, the exclusive awarders of honor and blame, right? We ought to care, I think, more about how the people we know and care for think of us than we do about what the New York Times says, right? So that's one thought. But even on the media, I'm not entirely sure that that is an accurate description of local life. I mean, it's clearly not Tocqueville's heyday where every small town has its own newspaper, but there are small town newspapers. People do read them very carefully, and that matters. So it would require, you're absolutely right, a profound reorientation of the way we live politically primarily, particularly for people who are talented enough to live at a higher level. I don't think it's utterly, totally hopeless, because one still can win even a national reputation, it seems to me, for very dramatic action on the local level. Now, we see this in the big cities more than in these small towns that I'm talking about. If like Rahm Emanuel was really able to clean up Chicago, that would be something, right? He could go somewhere from that. Giuliani in New York, that sort of thing. But being mayor of a town still offers some kind of portal, something else. But the key is not that, right? The key is getting people to realize that the sorts of praise and fulfillment that's on offer on the national level is just of a different sort than is on offer on the local level. That's a hard case to make, absolutely, and it's really hard because the institutions we have for awarding honor, you're right, are more oriented towards the national and the global than towards the local. But it does seem to me that there's at least a philosophical basis for making that kind of argument.
Hi, Tad Daly's my name. I'm with a local NGO called Citizens for Global Solutions. I have just a quick micro question and then a larger question. Okay. All your citations and references to Plutarch, is that all from the lives or other?
Yeah, sorry, I maybe should have indicated that. Yeah, a lot of, so are all the citations from the lives? No. One of the things that I'm trying to do in my work on Plutarch is come up with a picture of how we read his works from what we call the Moralia. Plutarch didn't call them the Moralia, but we collect all of his non-lives into one big group that we call the Moralia. So I was drawing from a number of those essays as well as from the lives. And in particular, the one that I drew from several times was, it's called Political Precepts, is the way it's translated. But it's this letter that Plutarch writes to a young Greek man who says, Plutarch, you seem to know a lot about politics. Please give me some advice, right? I'm going to start my political career. Give me some advice. And he writes this long letter that gives us one of the most vivid pictures of what political life looks like in the cities that we have from that period of the Roman Empire.
Is there some good collection somewhere where I can
Yeah, unfortunately.
beyond the line?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there are some old translations that are fairly good. My recommendation is to use the Loeb translations. They're more accurate than the old ones that we have. If you really like hard copies, which we all should, it's unfortunately quite expensive to buy all the Loebs because they're little books. Yeah, but most of them are online actually now. In fact, the translations that are fairly good. Yeah.
Let me ask
Yeah.
my larger question. It seems to me that it's hard to argue that Rome's singular towering achievement for about 500 years was the abolition of war within its territory, between the Irish Sea and the Persian Gulf, Gibraltar and the Caspian Sea. Local cities, local tribes, local nations did not go to war against the nation over the hill because there was this larger Roman authority over them. Now you have argued, and I think you said both Plutarch and Gibbon argue that great, but for all those local entities, they became languid and unambitious, and as I think you said, retreated into private affairs.
That's right.
So I've described the world in, let's say, 200 AD.
Yeah.
So now let's fast forward 500 years to 700 AD. Those local units,
Yeah.
tribes, and even elites, they had that authority back.
Yeah.
They were responsible for their own defense and other things. Well, gosh, I am not a professional historian, but everything I've read says that the human condition in that territory
Yeah.
in 700 AD was a lot worse than it was in 200
Yeah.
AD, which seems to be the opposite of what I think you're
Yeah, it's a great point. Okay, so let me restate. For all of the kind of end of history, last man qualities of the Pax Romana, right, that Gibbon and Plutarch are talking about, it's peaceful there, and you would much prefer to live in that situation than in like the 7th century when the barbarian hordes are rushing in, no one can maintain control. It's a nightmare, right? I think that's absolutely right, but I actually think that Plutarch agrees with that. As I read him anyway, and Gibbon certainly does. That his point is not that that we should just reject the empire completely and revert to the Peloponnesian War and all the other glorious wars that we read about in Greek history. I think his point is that actually it's good for human happiness to have peace. It's just that we have to find a way to combat some of the negative tendencies that peace gives rise to. Right? So another way of putting it is, in the words of William James, he wants some moral equivalent of war, some way of continuing to engage in political life without that taking the form of being out on the battlefield all the time. Now, what's interesting about Plutarch is that even though he's thinking about that question, he does it by means of telling us a lot of war stories, right? So in the Life of the Alexander, he says that his focus isn't going to be on the battles. Instead, it's on these other qualities that these characters have, and that's true. But there's lots of war in Plutarch, right? It's very hard to tell the story of that period in ancient history without it. And so somehow he seems to want to translate that experience back into another register, right? And to maintain some kind of political allegiance, even though the actual fighting isn't being done.
We are out of time. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Let's thank you.
Thanks.